Thomas Mitchell, a 17-year-old with cerebral palsy, lives with his mother Elena in the Oak Ridge Estates community. Though his mobility is limited and his speech sometimes falters, Thomas possesses an extraordinary mind that few recognize beneath his physical limitations. He's been fascinated with law since childhood, devouring legal textbooks and court cases, while his peers played video games. When Elena receives a violation notice from their homeowners association regarding the wheelchair ramp they installed at their front entrance, she's furious. The notice claims the ramp violates the community's aesthetic guidelines and must be removed within 30 days or they'll face significant fines. Elena knows the ramp is essential for Thomas and meets all legal requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. After her polite attempts to resolve the issue are rebuffed by HOA President Richard Harmon, a retired corporate executive known for his inflexibility, Elena reluctantly prepares to fight the violation. Thomas, overhearing his mother's distressed phone calls, begins quietly researching HOA regulations and disability accommodation laws, knowing this battle will require more than just moral righteousness. The rain pelts against Thomas's bedroom window as he meticulously examines the HOA's bylaws on his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminates his determined face in the dimly lit room. His fingers, though sometimes uncooperative, move with purpose across his specially designed keyboard. 3 years of legal forum participation under the username LexLogician has earned him respect in online legal communities, though none of his virtual colleagues know his age or condition. Elena appears in his doorway, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and worry. "You should get some sleep, honey. It's almost midnight." Thomas looks up, his eyes sharp with focus. "Did you know that in Gronner-Aviv Woodhaven Community Association, the court ruled that HOAs cannot enforce aesthetic guidelines that effectively prohibit reasonable accommodations?" "That's us, Mom." Elena sighs, entering the room to straighten his blanket. "Thomas, I appreciate this, but we can't afford a lawyer. Mr. Harmon made it clear. Either we remove the ramp or pay fines we can't afford." Thomas turns his screen toward her, revealing dozens of organized folders labeled with legal terms. "I've been preparing for something like this for years. I've studied every relevant case." His voice, which often betrays his condition with irregular pauses, is steady with conviction. "They're counting on us not knowing our rights. They're counting on us being intimidated." Elena sits on the edge of his bed, the weight of single parenthood heavy on her shoulders. "And what if we lose? We can't risk losing the house." Thomas's lips form a subtle smile. "That's why we won't lose. I have a plan." Elena attends the monthly HOA meeting with Thomas to appeal the violation. The meeting room falls uncomfortably silent when Thomas wheels in, with several board members exchanging glances. Richard Harmon runs the meeting with rigid formality, calling their case a simple matter of rule enforcement. When Elena presents their case, emphasizing the necessity of the ramp for Thomas's independence, she's interrupted repeatedly by board members citing bylaws and property values. Thomas tries to interject with legal points about reasonable accommodations, but Harmon dismisses him, speaking slowly and loudly as if Thomas couldn't understand normal speech, saying, "We're discussing complex legal matters, young man." Several neighbors appear uncomfortable with the treatment, but remain silent. Only Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman from across the street, speaks up in their defense, recanting how Thomas had helped her understand her Medicare documents. Her support isn't enough, however, and the board votes 6-1 to uphold the violation. Leaving the meeting, Thomas whispers to his mother, "They made a procedural error, Mom, and I know exactly how to use it." The community centre's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the room as Thomas watches Harmon shuffle papers with deliberate slowness. The board members avoid making eye contact with him, except for Patricia Walsh, who keeps glancing at his wheelchair with poorly disguised pity. The ramp disrupts the architectural harmony we've established in Oak Ridge, explains Harmon, projecting before and after photos of the Mitchell home onto the wall screen. As you can see, it's an eyesore that diminishes neighbouring property values. Thomas feels his muscles tightening with frustration, a physical reaction he's learned to manage through breathing techniques. He notices Harmon repeatedly referencing Addendum C, but Thomas has studied the HOA documentation thoroughly and knows this addendum was never properly ratified according to their own bylaws. When Thomas attempts to raise this point, Harmon cuts him off mid-sentence. "Perhaps your mother can explain your concerns," he suggests with a patronizing smile. The injustice burns in Thomas's chest as he observes the procedural violations accumulating. The board fails to properly record the motion, skips the required reading of the relevant bylaw section, and Harmon repeatedly makes parliamentary errors that go unchallenged. Thomas documents each mistake meticulously on his tablet, his fingers occasionally struggling with the precision required. After the vote, as they navigate toward the exit, board member Walsh approaches them. "I'm sorry about all this," she whispers, her voice tinged with genuine regret. "Richard's been impossible since he lost his position at Gartner Corp. This isn't right." Thomas nods politely, tucking this information away. As they leave the building, he feels a curious sensation, not defeat, but the quiet certainty of someone who has just witnessed his opponents reveal all their weaknesses. Rather than removing the ramp, Elena consults with an attorney who quotes a retainer fee far beyond their means. Seeing his mother's despair, Thomas reveals his plan. He's been studying property law and disability rights for years through online courses from prestigious law schools. Though not yet a lawyer, he understands enough to help them self-represent in the upcoming hearing. Through meticulous research, Thomas discovers the HOA has a pattern of discriminatory enforcement, with similar modifications allowed for non-disabled residents. He also uncovers that the board failed to follow proper procedures for rule changes 3 years ago, potentially invalidating their current aesthetic guidelines. Thomas begins preparing documents, practicing arguments, and anticipating counterpoints. His bedroom transforms into a makeshift legal office with color-coded files and legal textbooks. Elena watches with equal parts pride and concern as Thomas works late into the night, his determination overcoming his physical fatigue. Meanwhile, Richard Harmon consults with the HOA's attorney, assuring him this will be an open and shut case against a woman and her disabled son who clearly don't understand how rules work. The kitchen table disappears beneath stacks of papers as Thomas constructs their case. He's created a timeline of the HOA's selective enforcement, with photographs of permitted modifications. Mrs. Russell's decorative portico, the Hendersons' stone pathway, and most damning, Vice President Parker's extended deck that required a variance from the same aesthetic guidelines they're using against the Mitchells. Public records are fascinating, Thomas says, showing Elena a document he obtained through a records request. 3 years ago, when they amended the aesthetic guidelines, they failed to properly notify all homeowners as required by state law and their own charter. Elena sorts through homeowner testimony she's gathered from sympathetic neighbours. Mrs. Jenkins says she never received notice about the meeting where they changed the rules. "That's our procedural argument," Thomas nods, his eyes bright despite the dark circles beneath them. His speech is more laboured when he's tired, but his mind remains razor sharp. But our rights argument is stronger. The Fair Housing Amendments Act requires them to permit reasonable modifications. Late that evening, Thomas's laptop pings with an email notification. It's from Patricia Walsh, the conflicted board member, who has sent him the board's private discussions regarding their case. "I can't stand what they're doing," her message reads. "Richard told everyone to make an example of your family." Thomas sits back, processing this new information. It's the evidence of discriminatory intent they needed. His hands may tremble as he types his response, but there's no uncertainty in his mind about what comes next. The HOA believes they're facing a disabled teenager and his overwhelmed mother. By the time they realize their mistake, it will be too late. The day of the municipal court hearing arrives. The HOA's attorney, James Wilson, appears confident as he sets up at his table, barely acknowledging Elena and Thomas. Richard Harmon sits behind him with several board members, occasionally glancing dismissively at Thomas struggling to organize his papers with his limited dexterity. When the case is called, Wilson makes a show of expressing sympathy for Thomas's condition, while firmly maintaining that rules must apply equally to all residents. He argues that allowing exceptions would create a slippery slope for the community standards. When it's their turn, Elena begins nervously, but is quickly interrupted by the judge asking if they have legal representation. Thomas speaks up, his voice initially faltering, but growing stronger as he explains they're representing themselves. Wilson smirks visibly as Thomas struggles to pull a document from his folder. The judge, appearing impatient, asks Thomas if he understands the proceedings. Thomas responds by calmly citing 3 relevant precedent cases regarding reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act. The courtroom falls silent. The judge raises an eyebrow, suddenly paying closer attention. The municipal courtroom feels smaller than Thomas imagined, its wood-panelled walls closing in as Judge Merrill Harrison reviews the case files. Thomas feels sweat beading on his forehead. His specialized tablet, loaded with case citations and evidence, sits ready on his lap, technology bridging the gap between his physical limitations and his intellectual capabilities. Wilson rises with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with the Mitchell family's situation, Oak Ridge Estates has clear guidelines that all residents agreed to upon purchasing their properties." His voice drips with rehearsed compassion. "These guidelines maintain our community standards and property values. Making exceptions, even in unfortunate circumstances, would undermine the very purpose of having an HOA." Richard Harmon notes approvingly from his seat, exchanging satisfied glances with board members. Only Patricia Walsh looks uncomfortable, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When Thomas begins to speak, his words come haltingly at first, a symptom of his condition that often leads people to underestimate him. Judge Harrison's expression reveals her initial skepticism as she asks, "Young man, do you have any legal training?" Thomas takes a deep breath, steadying his voice. "Your Honor, in Gibeler v. M. and B. Associates, the Ninth Circuit held that accommodations are reasonable when they impose no fundamental alteration in the nature of the program, and no undue financial or administrative burdens." His speech grows more fluid as he continues. "Our ramp meets all safety requirements, and according to the HOA's own engineer report, dated March 15th, creates no structural concerns." Wilson's smirk fades. Judge Harrison straightens in her chair, her attention now fully captured. Behind Thomas, Elena watches her son transform before her eyes into something their opponents never expected, a formidable legal adversary. As the hearing continues, Thomas transforms. His physical limitations seem to fade as his legal brilliance emerges. He methodically presents evidence of the HOA's inconsistent enforcement, citing specific examples with documentation. He demonstrates how the board's own bylaws weren't followed in establishing the aesthetic guidelines, rendering them potentially invalid. When Wilson objects, claiming Thomas's arguments are irrelevant, Thomas calmly responds with such precise legal reasoning that the judge overrules nearly every objection. He presents a compelling argument about the intersection of property rights and disability accommodations, weaving together constitutional principles with practical considerations. The courtroom audience grows as word spreads about the remarkable young man. Court staff pause their work to listen. Richard Harmon's confident expression gradually deteriorates into concern as he whispers urgently to his attorney. In his closing argument, Thomas addresses the court with dignity. This case isn't merely about a ramp. It's about whether our communities will recognize that accessibility isn't special treatment, it's equal treatment. The law doesn't ask for charity, it demands justice. Thomas methodically displays photographs of the approved modifications throughout Oak Ridge Estates, projecting them onto the courtroom's evidence screen. Exhibit C shows Vice President Parker's deck extension, approved March 2023, which violates the same guidelines as our ramp. Exhibit D shows the Henderson stone pathway, approved July 2022. Exhibit E shows. Objection, Your Honor. Wilson interrupts, his voice strained. These other modifications aren't relevant to the Mitchell case. Judge Harrison studies Thomas thoughtfully. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Mitchell. Thomas nods gratefully, his movements deliberate. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discriminatory housing practices. The pattern of selective enforcement demonstrated here constitutes exactly such discrimination. He then presents Patricia Walsh's email evidence, causing Richard Harmon's face to flush red. The board's intent to make an example of us reveals this isn't about guidelines. It's about targeting a disabled resident. Wilson rises again. Your Honor, this is hearsay from a disgruntled board member. Thomas responds without hesitation. Under Federal Rule of Evidence 802D, this constitutes an admission by a party opponent's agent concerning a matter within the scope of the agency relationship. The judge blinks, visibly impressed. Thomas continues, his voice steady despite the occasional physical tremor. Furthermore, the guidelines themselves were improperly adopted. According to Oak Ridge's own charter, Section 7.2 requires written notice to all homeowners 30 days before any rule change vote. He produces affidavits from 12 homeowners, including Mrs. Jenkins, all testifying they never received such notice. A court clerk whispers to a colleague. 2 law students in the back scribble furious notes. Wilson's legal pad is now covered in agitated scrawls as he struggles to counter arguments he never anticipated facing. The judge rules decisively in Thomas and Elena's favor, not only allowing the ramp to remain, but also ordering the HOA to review all of its guidelines for ADA compliance. Additionally, the judge imposes a fine on the HOA for their willful disregard of reasonable accommodation requirements. As they leave the courtroom, several law students attending as observers approach Thomas to express their admiration. One of them mentions that her professor, a disability rights attorney, would be interested in meeting him. Richard Harmon attempts to leave quietly, but Elena approaches him, not to gloat, but to propose working together on making the community more inclusive. In the following months, Thomas receives a scholarship offer from a prestigious law school with an early admission program. The case gains attention in legal circles, leading to Thomas being invited to speak at a disability rights conference. The HOA undergoes significant changes with several new board members elected who prioritize inclusive community standards. Mrs. Jenkins spearheads a neighborhood initiative to identify and remove accessibility barriers throughout the community. As Thomas helps a new family with a disabled child move into the neighborhood without HOA interference, Elena reflects on how what began as discrimination became the catalyst for revealing her son's extraordinary gifts to the world. Thomas doesn't just have a future as a lawyer, he's already changing lives through the law he loves. Judge Harrison's gavel strikes with finality. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA is hereby ordered to permit the wheelchair ramp at the Mitchell residence and to pay damages in the amount of $7,500 for violations of the Fair Housing Act. Her stern gaze sweeps across the HOA representatives. Additionally, the court orders Oak Ridge Estates to conduct a full review of its guidelines for ADA compliance within 90 days. Outside the courtroom, Elena embraces Thomas, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispers. Thomas smiles, his body exhausted, but his spirit soaring. Patricia Walsh approaches them hesitantly. "That was remarkable, Thomas. Truly." She hands him a business card. "My sister is on the admissions committee at State University Law School. She'd like to speak with you." Richard Harmon hurries past, his shoulders hunched in defeat, but Elena gently touches his arm. He turns, surprise evident on his face. "Mr. Harmon," she says quietly, "when you're ready to discuss making Oak Ridge more accessible for everyone, we'd be happy to help." The invitation to reconciliation hangs in the air. 3 months later, Thomas sits before his computer, reading an acceptance letter with a full scholarship offer. The local paper has published a feature on him titled "Legal Mind Beyond Barriers." His inbox contains invitations to speak at 3 disability rights conferences. From his window, he watches as workers install a new accessible playground in the community common area, the first project of the newly elected HOA board, which now includes Mrs. Jenkins as Accessibility Compliance Officer. A moving truck pulls up across the street where a family with a young girl in a wheelchair is moving in. "Mom," Thomas calls out, his voice steady with purpose, "I think we should go welcome them to the neighborhood."